Two hungry twin boys steal a loaf of bread, but what they uncover is far more dangerous than hunger. A missing security tape, a reappearing father, a city block marked for quiet erasure, and one man, Big Shaq, who trades silence for truth and fame for justice. In a world where kids are currency and corruption hides in plain sight, one act of kindness becomes a revolution. This isn't just about survival, it's about who gets to stay. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heat in Newark, New Jersey doesn't just rise, it presses. It pushes down on roofs, seeps through sidewalks, and clings to skin like a desperate hand. On the eastern edge of the city, where the shine of redevelopment hasn't reached and street names are more familiar to probation officers than tour guides, the morning sun already stirs something heavy. This isn't the kind of heat that fades. It lingers, makes people tired before the day even starts. And beneath that sweltering stillness, something is shifting. Big Shaq, or just Shaq to those who've watched him fade from NBA legend to local guardian angel, rises early, always has. But now his mornings are different. Gone are the squeak of sneakers on polished courts and the roar of arenas. They've been replaced by the shuffle of folding chairs and the clink of canned goods onto battered pantry shelves. He shows up at the Maple Grove Community Shelter before most volunteers are awake, letting himself in with a spare key he never asked for but was trusted with anyway. In this corner of the city, trust is currency, and Big Shaq's account is full. He moves through the shelter with a kind of purposeful quiet, acknowledging the volunteers with nods, checking inventory with a glance, and gently offering more than just food presence, warmth, a sense that someone's still watching out. He's not here for applause. He's here because he knows what it's like to go to sleep on an empty stomach and pretend you're full. And on this particular morning, something feels off. It's in the air, the way people pass each other without speaking, the whispers around the coffee urn, the hushed looks toward the back wall, where a faded bulletin board holds up more bad news than anyone wants to read. There's talk of a theft, small, petty, and desperate. A loaf of bread stolen from Calder's Corner Market, 3 blocks down, not a big deal to most. But in this part of Newark, it's never just bread. Shaq doesn't ask questions. Not yet. He listens. His instincts, the same ones that read opposing defenses and spotted open lanes before they existed, now pick up on murmurs, flinches, and glances. He pieces it together quickly. 2 boys, thin, quiet, fast, grabbed a loaf, ran. The cashier didn't get a good look, but someone outside mentioned twins. And that's when the recognition hits him. Not their faces. He hasn't met them, but their names. Camden and Jalen. They've appeared on the shelter's sign-in sheet 3 times this past month, scrawled in unsure handwriting that made the intake worker double-check the spelling. Boys that came in alone. Boys who never stayed long enough to eat a full meal. Boys who left before anyone could ask too much. The shelter records don't say much. No birthdays, no parental contact, just a note scribbled in the margins once, with grandmother, looks ill, should follow up. But no one did. Not because they didn't care, but because that list of shoulds is longer than anyone can handle. Meanwhile, across town, the boys are hiding. Not from cops, but from shame. They didn't mean to steal. Not really. It didn't feel like theft when their grandmother hadn't eaten in 2 days, and her cough sounded like gravel. It didn't feel like a crime when their stomachs ached so bad they thought about eating croutons from a sidewalk dumpster. Camden, the slightly older one by 7 minutes, had tried to be brave. He'd told Jalen to wait outside and watch for people, but both of them ran. Both of them knew both of them didn't care anymore. Their apartment, if you can call it that, isn't a place you'd linger. It's a single-bedroom unit, in a crumbling 3-story building, with chipped paint and rusted rails. Their grandmother, Miss Etta, sleeps in the front room, hooked up to a borrowed oxygen tank that leaks more than it helps. The electricity flickers. The fridge hums but barely cools. The walls are stained from years of rain seeping through the roof. The kind of place you survive in, not live in. There's a silence between the boys as they tear small pieces from the stolen bread, dipping it into water to make it feel like more. Jalen's eyes scan the room like someone might barge in. Camden watches the door too, not from fear, but responsibility. He's always listening for Miss Etta's breathing. She's all they have, and she's not doing well. Back at the shelter, Shaq steps outside for a breath of air, though the air outside offers no relief. He's not a detective, not a social worker, But his gut doesn't lie, and something about this situation stays with him. Maybe it's because he's seen it before. Maybe because it was him once. He remembers being that kid, pretending to laugh louder than his hunger, hiding his mother's exhaustion from nosy neighbors. He remembers choosing between sneakers and supper. That memory carries him down to Calder's Market, where Mr. Danvers, gray beard, angry jaw, replays the theft like it was a heist. He complains loudly, not just about the bread, but about what it means. Kids these days, he says. No respect, no fathers, no discipline. Shaq doesn't argue. He lets Danvers rant. But then he asks one question. You call the cops? Danvers hesitates, shrugs. I started to, but I couldn't get the footage to work. Shaq raises a brow. You got cameras. Sure do. But someone wiped the feed. That hits him. Cameras don't just glitch. And someone erasing footage? That doesn't sound like hungry kids covering tracks. That sounds like someone trying to keep eyes off the boys for a reason. The theft is the surface, but Shaq knows how problems hide behind problems. And suddenly, this isn't just about two hungry kids. It's about what they're running from. Later that afternoon, Shaq returns to the shelter, but he doesn't go inside. He walks the surrounding blocks instead, past the school with the broken buzzer, past the rec center that's been closed for repairs since winter, past the alleyways where hope gets traded for anything that feels like an escape. He's looking for the twins, not to punish, not to lecture, but to understand. And he finds something else. A neighbor, a woman with 3 kids of her own, says she saw 2 boys sneaking into Building 11 off Hawthorne. Real quiet, polite kids, she says, but they look scared all the time. Shaq thanks her. He doesn't go in yet. He'll come back tomorrow, with food, with time, with the kind of presence these streets don't see often. That night, as the city hums and the shelter locks up, Shaq sits on his back porch, old sneakers on, knees aching, sipping a glass of warm water. He thinks about the boys, about what comes next, about how the world treats poverty like a personal failure, when most days just surviving takes everything you've got. He looks out into the distance, where the city skyline barely peaks above broken rooftops. And he knows, deep in his chest, that this is only the beginning. He doesn't know exactly what he's stepping into, but he knows why. And sometimes the why is enough to start a storm. The morning air was thick enough to slice, even before the sun had claimed its place above the skyline. Newark felt like it was sweating from the inside out. Sidewalks steamed. Windows refused to cool. Somewhere in the city's core, a pair of boys moved fast, barely shadowed. Camden and Jalen weren't just running from a store. They were running from decisions made long before they were born. Inside Calder's Corner Market, the ceiling fans spun with little purpose. The air was still stale. The shelves weren't stocked like the chain stores uptown. But to kids with empty fridges, they looked like treasure. The bread rack was right by the exit, an old trick Shaq once remembered, to get people to leave with more than they came for. Camden hadn't taken more than he needed. 1 loaf. Enough to last a day or 2, if rationed. But need never looks neat when you're desperate. Mr. Danvers, the store owner, was sweeping up near the freezer when he spotted the flash. 2 boys slipping through the aisle, hands quick, feet quicker. The bell above the door rang out behind them, slicing the silence in half. Danvers made it to the door a second too late, and all he saw was the retreating blur of Camden's red hoodie. Little punks, he muttered, jabbing numbers into his ancient landline. The cops didn't respond with sirens. Not here. They responded with paperwork and indifference. But a report was filed. The footage was requested. Protocol. And across town at the Maple Grove shelter, Shaq was stocking crates of dry goods, when Lana, a high school volunteer, came up behind him, holding her phone like it had bad news. They're saying some kids hit Calder's, she said, tapping the screen. 2 boys stole bread. Shaq didn't respond right away. His eyes narrowed, not in anger but in recognition. He'd heard stories like this before, seen faces like theirs before they even showed up. Hunger left marks deeper than bruises. The boys didn't have names in the article, just descriptions. 2 minors, possibly related. Light frame, red hoodie, red hoodie. His memory jumped back to the shelter's Monday morning roster. Handwriting barely legible. But the note stood out. Camden W. Jalen W. Requested second servings, did not stay. That wasn't a theft. That was a signal. By midday, Shaq had quietly slipped out the back of the shelter and made his way toward the corner market. The street outside Calder's felt unusually still. The sun had everyone pressed against shade. He entered the store like a regular customer, nodding once to Danvers behind the counter. Danvers gave him that same wary look he always did. The kind that said, "I respect you, but I don't trust this neighborhood." Shaq walked the bread aisle. The shelf was mostly full again. New loaves stacked since the theft. It seemed absurd that a missing piece of white bread had triggered so much. But in places like this, everything was personal, and nothing was forgotten. "Shaquille," Danvers said, coming around the counter. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I heard about the boys," Shaq said. "Straight to it." Danvers sighed, crossing his arms. "What do you want me to say? They stole. That's not on me." "I'm not saying it is." Danvers tilted his head. "You here to play peacemaker?" Shaq didn't blink. "I'm here to understand." Danvers didn't like the tone. "I've got bills. I've got theft insurance. But this is about principle. You let it slide. They come back. Then it's liquor. Then it's cash." "You file a report?" Shaq asked. Danvers nodded. "Already did. Gave them what I had. Pulled the security feed this morning." "And?" Danvers scratched his temple. "Here's the weird part. The footage. It's gone. Just that hour. Black screen. Rest of the day's clean." Shaq leaned in. "Gone as in what?" "Deleted. Wiped," Danvers said. "Like someone scrubbed it. No glitch. No freeze. Just empty." Shaq said nothing. His mind ran cold. Who deletes camera footage of two hungry kids stealing bread? Not the kids. Not Danvers. Someone else. As he stepped back outside, a low breeze offered momentary relief, but it did nothing to cool the suspicion burning in Shaq's chest. The theft wasn't a surprise, but the cover-up was. He didn't head back to the shelter. Instead, he walked 2 blocks down to Westover Elementary, the local school where many of the shelter kids were registered. The building looked like it belonged in another decade. Cracked bricks, metal doors, and a playground too rusted for use. He didn't need to go inside to know what he'd find. Overworked teachers, underfunded lunch programs, and students slipping through cracks faster than administrators could record absences. He glanced through the gate. There, tucked into a corner near the water fountain, a familiar red hoodie. Camden, alone, looking down. Shaq didn't approach. Not yet. He watched. The boy didn't move much. No playing, no talking, just sitting, like the world had already made him older than his age could explain. Shaq remembered being 10 and feeling 30. It aged your back, your thoughts, made everything heavy. He walked away before Camden noticed him. Not because he didn't want to talk, but because kids like him didn't respond to sudden help. You had to earn your way in. That evening, Shaq sat in the shelter's break room, flipping through local community board updates. One thread caught his attention. Someone anonymously warning other small business owners about missing surveillance data. A few replies echoed similar problems. A bakery down on Winstead Street, a laundromat on 8th Avenue. All had one thing in common: minor thefts. Kids. Footage missing. Patterns didn't lie. Someone was watching, controlling what was seen and what wasn't. But why? The next morning, Shaq returned to the neighborhood, this time with intention. He brought a bag of groceries, not charity, just necessities. Canned beans, peanut butter, pasta. He didn't knock on Camden and Jalen's door, though he now knew exactly where they lived. Unit 3B in the crumbling Glenview complex. Instead, he left the bag on the doorstep, attached a note, "For your grandmother, from a friend. Stay strong." He walked away before anyone could see his face. He knew how pride worked, how survival meant keeping your dignity, even if it was held together with tape and hope. By noon, he was back at the shelter, cross-referencing service records. The twins' names had shown up 5 times now, but never together. One always came. The other waited. Like they had a system. Like they'd learned to cover for each other. Shaq sat with that thought. The system failed them, so they built their own. The loaf of bread, the missing video, the silence around their lives. It all pointed to a bigger truth. These boys weren't just hungry, they were being erased. Someone was making sure no one saw how bad it had gotten. Someone who had something to gain by keeping them invisible. Shaq leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. He didn't know who yet, or why. But the theft wasn't the crime here.
What was happening behind it was.
And he was going to find out. The neighborhood didn't change overnight, but something in Shaq did. The bread incident, the missing footage, the boys' hollow silence, none of it sat right. He wasn't angry at them. He was angry for them. And more than that, he was tired of watching the same cycle devour new names. This wasn't the first time he'd seen kids slip between the cracks. But this time, he didn't just see it, he felt it. Deep. And that made all the difference. He started where most wouldn't bother. The school. Westover Elementary had the bones of something built with good intentions. But the flesh was long gone. Peeling paint, windows that didn't open right, and a cafeteria menu that promised hot meals, but often delivered cold excuses. Shaq didn't go in wearing fame. He dressed like a volunteer. Plain t-shirt, worn jeans, clipboard in hand, the kind of look that let people underestimate him. He asked for attendance records. Not officially, just to understand what support looks like lately. The woman at the front desk, a tight-lipped administrator named Mrs. Delane, didn't want to hand them over, but she also didn't want to argue with a man of Shaq's stature. The list confirmed what he already knew. Camden and Jalen were ghost students. Spotty attendance, gaps as wide as weeks. Multiple days marked present, even when Shaq knew they hadn't shown up. That was the first red flag. The second came when he asked about their lunch records. Students with free meal eligibility usually scanned cards, digital breadcrumbs showing who was fed and who wasn't. But for the twins, there were dozens of entries left blank. It looked like they were skipping meals. But Shaq had a different theory. Someone was scanning them in without them ever arriving. He didn't confront the staff, not yet. He simply thanked them, smiled, and left. But he wrote down every name on the bottom of that sign-in list. Next stop was their home. Glenview Complex, Building 11, where the boys lived with their grandmother. The structure leaned like it was exhausted. Shaq stood outside the building one evening, as the sun dropped behind distant smokestacks, watching as tenants came and went. Nobody smiled. A few nodded. Some ignored him entirely. Trust wasn't easy currency here. He made his way to the superintendent's office under the guise of asking about repairs. The guy, Terry Lanks, mid-40s, shirt stained with oil and contempt, barely looked up from his chair. "You media or charity?" he grunted. "Neither," Shaq said. That got Terry's attention. "Then what are you?" "Just a neighbor who gives a damn." Terry scoffed but waved him in. The walls inside the office were covered in faded work orders and unanswered maintenance slips. Shaq scanned the pages, noting how many names repeated. He spotted Camden and Jalen's apartment. Unit 3B, on at least 4 complaint forms: heating failure, leaky ceiling, exposed wiring, broken lock. "When were these handled?" Shaq asked casually. Terry shrugged. "They ain't dead, are they? I'll get to it." Shaq kept his expression flat, but inside, something simmered. These weren't just neglected conditions. They were designed to be ignored. And people like Terry weren't incompetent. They were trained by the system to do nothing and call it effort. That night, Shaq returned with groceries again. Same drill. Quiet drop at the door. No note this time. But now, he added something else. A book. A worn paperback titled Holes, not because he expected the boys to read it immediately, but because he knew it would speak to them. A story about boys like them, punished for the sins of adults, digging their way out with nothing but each other. Over the next few days, Shaq escalated. Subtly, strategically, he started reaching out to old contacts. A former city auditor who now ran a housing rights group. A retired librarian who helped monitor school board funding. He didn't name the boys, but he described their building, their school, and the errors he was finding. The response was always the same. "Yeah, we've heard whispers, but nothing ever sticks. No proof." So Shaq began gathering proof. He didn't carry a badge or a title, but he carried weight. He walked the building halls and noted the patterns: apartments consistently without maintenance, families given conflicting lease notices, one single mother forced to leave after complaining too loudly. Every story added to the puzzle. Every neighbor confirmed what he suspected. Glenview wasn't failing from neglect. It was being drained slowly, methodically. At the school, he came back weekly, asked innocent questions. How many lunches were served? How was attendance trending? Who monitored the scanners? No one could give him clean answers. The principal, a man named Derek Fulmer, spoke in smooth half-truths, blaming staffing shortages and funding gaps. But he didn't expect follow-up. So when Shaq brought up the twins' attendance logs, The color drained from Fulmer's face just a bit too fast. It clicked. Someone was padding numbers. Maybe for federal funding. Maybe just to keep their performance metrics up. Either way, it explained a lot. And the kids like Camden and Jalen, they were being used, their absence manipulated into presence for someone else's game. Meanwhile, Shaq kept the quiet work going. More groceries. Another book. Bud, not Buddy. Then the Watsons go to Birmingham. Not textbooks. Not rules. Stories. Survivors. Hope. The twins never came to the door. But the next bag he dropped off was lighter the next morning. That was all he needed to know. He started to see them too. In passing. Jalen once by the school fence. Camden waiting in line at the shelter, but ducking out before entering. They were watching him as much as he was watching them, testing his consistency, his intent. And Shaq delivered. Not with speeches, not with press, but with presence. One day, he left 2 new backpacks outside their door. Inside were notebooks, pencils, and a small hand-drawn map of every free resource in the neighborhood. Shelters, clinics, reading programs. Not gifts, tools. At the shelter, Lana pulled him aside. Those boys you asked about. They showed up today, ate everything on their plate, didn't say a word. Shaq nodded, but didn't smile. He knew what came next wasn't simple. These kids didn't just need food or books. They needed protection, because someone had gone to great lengths to erase them, and Shaq was starting to realize why. His hunch solidified when he received a call from Griff Temple, an old friend and retired journalist who owed Shaq a favor. I dug into the Glenview property records, Griff said. You won't believe this. That building? It's been under review for redevelopment for over a year. Zoned already, quietly. Someone's pushing people out slow, so it doesn't make news. Shaq exhaled through his teeth. In the school? Same. New charter application filed 3 months ago. If attendance drops low enough, they can shut it down. Rezone. Sell the land. Shaq's mind spun. This wasn't just neglect. This was a takedown disguised as decay. Camden and Jalen weren't just collateral. They were the easiest to move because they had no paperwork, no advocate, no voice. Until now. Shaq didn't storm into offices. He didn't post on social media. He started building a case, collecting names, dates, patterns, anonymous testimonies. He coordinated with his contacts quietly, assembling something undeniable. He'd seen too many exposés fizzle out because they lacked structure. He wasn't going to let that happen here. He also knew time was short. Whatever was coming, the forced evictions, the school's quiet closure, it would happen fast once people stopped paying attention. So Shaq focused harder. Every day he showed up, and every night he wrote notes, plans, threads to pull. At the end of one of those nights, he walked back to the twins' door with something new. A journal. Blank. Except for the inside cover, where he'd written one line. When you write it down, it doesn't own you anymore. He didn't need thanks. He needed them to know they weren't invisible. And for the first time when he stepped away from their door, he heard something behind it. A page turning. Things had begun to shift. Not for the world, not for the city, but for Camden and Jalen. Something had changed. It wasn't just the meals, or the backpacks, or the quiet acts of care left at their door. It was the feeling that someone was finally watching, and not in a way that punished them, but protected them. They still moved cautiously, like boys who knew trust could cost you everything. But they weren't running anymore. Not from hunger, not from the cold, not yet. Shaq felt it too, that sliver of progress, delicate and real. He saw it in the way Jalen lingered at the shelter one morning, long enough to finish a second helping of eggs. In how Camden took a book from the community shelf and tucked it into his coat like it was currency. Little things, fragile but true. Shaq didn't smile easily, but when he did, it meant something. And lately he'd been smiling just enough to remind himself why he kept doing this. But hope has a way of attracting shadows. And on a humid Wednesday afternoon, one of those shadows stepped out of the past and into the doorway of Unit. His name was Wyatt Kinney, and he carried himself like a man used to apologies and second chances, except he didn't ask for either. Freshly pressed shirt, court documents tucked into a manila folder, and the kind of smile that was practiced but never reached the eyes. He said he was the boy's father, said he'd done his time, said he wanted to make things right, and no one had the power to say no. Not yet. Shaq first heard about him through Renee Callan, a social worker, who'd seen too many stories unravel at the last chapter. She'd called Shaq in quiet frustration. Man shows up with clean paperwork, release form, some notarized affidavit from a halfway house in Trenton, she said, not bothering to hide her doubt. Says he wants custody, hasn't seen those boys in 6 years, and the state's just considering it. Shaq asked. It's not up to the state, she replied. It's up to a family court judge, and a whole lot of good behavior reports. Shaq didn't say much, but something in his chest tightened. It wasn't just the timing, it was the precision. Wyatt Kinney had entered the picture just when the boys were beginning to find safety. Just when Shaq's slow-burning efforts were beginning to make noise. It was too clean, too polished, and too damn convenient. He walked to Glenview that night, stood across the street, watched as Wyatt came and went, blending in like he belonged. He greeted neighbors, carried takeout, even handed off an envelope to Terry Lanks, the superintendent, with a handshake that lasted a second too long. Shaq didn't need to hear the conversation to read it. Wyatt wasn't just here for the boys. He was here for something bigger. Shaq started asking around. Discreetly. He knew better than to accuse. He just listened. He found out Wyatt had once been a runner for a housing crew that flipped neighborhoods. Legal on paper, dirty in practice. His arrest 5 years ago wasn't for theft, but wire fraud. He'd taken fall money for someone else's game, kept quiet in court, and served his time like a soldier. Shaq had seen that kind of loyalty before, not to people, but to payout. Meanwhile, the boys didn't talk about Wyatt. Not to neighbors, not to teachers. They followed his lead, but their eyes told the real story. Not relief, not warmth, just compliance. Shaq saw it when Jalen shrunk a little smaller, walking past the shelter with Wyatt's hand on his shoulder. Saw it in how Camden stopped showing up at all. That wasn't reunion. That was retreat. Still, Wyatt's surface was spotless. Weekly visits to the caseworker, signed affidavits, compliance with every technicality. He quoted scripture in meetings, and used phrases like God's second chances and family restoration. The judges liked that kind of language. It moved paperwork faster. But Shaq wasn't moved. He stepped back from his direct support, not because he gave up, but because he needed to see the whole board. He went back to Griff Temple, the retired journalist, and they started tracing Wyatt's paper trail. What they found wasn't criminal. It was strategic. Wyatt's name was linked to a nonprofit recently funded by Councilman Clay Rourke, the same man pushing redevelopment contracts for Glenview and its surrounding blocks. The nonprofit's mission? Transitional housing for reunified families. The kind of title that sounded noble enough to skip scrutiny. Except no one from the community had heard of it. No families placed. No programs run. Just funding. On paper. Shaq looked closer. The nonprofit's address matched a realty firm that had been quietly buying up condemned buildings in Newark's revitalization zone. One of those buildings was Glenview. And the more Shaq dug, the clearer the picture became. Wyatt wasn't just here as a father. He was a pawn, or worse, a partner. The boys weren't his return to fatherhood. They were his ticket back into the money. See, if Wyatt gained custody, the boys would be relocated under the guise of child welfare. Glenview would be deemed unsafe for minors. Tenants would be offered payouts to leave or be forced out under emergency code violations. The building would empty, the permits would clear, and the redevelopment would begin. A clean sweep with no protests, no headlines, and no one left to ask questions. But Shaq was asking, and he wasn't alone. Renee, once skeptical, now worked with Shaq under the radar, digging into Wyatt's old associations. Griff drafted a quiet article, unpublished, but airtight. They didn't release it yet. They needed one more piece. So Shaq returned to Unit 3B, this time not as a silent helper but as a witness. He knocked. Wyatt answered, not surprised. Shaquille, he said with a politician's warmth. Heard you'd been around. Appreciate what you've done for my boys. Shaq didn't smile. You appreciate a lot of things when people do the work for you. Wyatt gestured him in. You want to come in, talk like men? Shaq looked him in the eye. I'm not here to talk. I'm here to tell you something. Wyatt leaned on the doorframe. Go ahead. If you're here for them, really for them, prove it. Stop the application. Let them stay where they're safe, where they've started to heal. Wyatt's smile dropped a half inch. That's not your call, man. You did your part. Let the family heal. Shaq stepped closer, voice low. You don't get to say family when your first visit comes with a contract. Wyatt didn't answer. But the door didn't close either. Shaq left without another word. He didn't need to win that night. He just needed Wyatt to know he wasn't invisible anymore. Later that week, Camden showed up at the shelter, alone. Quiet, but not hiding. He handed Shaq something small, a folded page from the journal Shaq had given him. 3 words. He's not right. Shaq folded the note and put it in his back pocket. No big reactions. No promises. Just a nod. And with that, the balance shifted again. The ghost had returned, but this time he wasn't the only one being watched. The city had a rhythm, a low thrum beneath the daily noise, like concrete breathing beneath worn sneakers and tired footsteps. Shaq had learned how to feel it, not just hear it. And lately that rhythm had started to shift. It wasn't louder, just darker, more coordinated, too clean in its chaos. And whenever a place like Glenview started to get quiet, Shaq knew what it meant. It meant the sweepers were coming. The kind that wore suits, not uniforms, and made deals behind conference doors that would never open to the people they displaced. What started with a loaf of bread was now pointing towards something far larger and far more dangerous, in the way that corruption always is when it wears the mask of bureaucracy. The twins weren't just victims of neglect. They were sitting on prime real estate. It began with a casual meeting. Griff Temple, his journalist friend, showed up at the shelter one morning, holding a rolled-up city planning document, like it was evidence from a crime scene. Rezoning plan, he said, unrolling it on Shaq's desk. Filed 3 months ago. Quiet as a whisper. But it's there. The map was detailed. Lines and labels in dry legalese. But the target was unmistakable. Glenview Complex. Sitting on a strip now marked priority redevelopment zone. Language like commercial integration, safety non-compliance, and public-private opportunity peppered the margins like camouflage. Shaq stared at the paper, his jaw tight. And Wyatt's timing? Griff tapped the document. Lines up too well. Within 2 weeks of this being filed, he's out, he's coached, and he's got custody paperwork in motion. Shaq leaned over the map, reading between the lines. This wasn't a spontaneous effort. This was a machine, and the twins were caught in its gears. The more they investigated, the more the names started overlapping. The redevelopment push was tied to a private consulting firm, and that firm shared board members with an economic advisory committee under Councilman Clay Rourke, the same Rourke who had recently fast-tracked demolition permits for other housing blocks under the banner of urban revitalization. Every time a block emptied, a development project followed within 60 days. Publicly it looked like improvement, but for residents it meant eviction wrapped in legalese. And Wyatt Kinney? His name showed up as a community liaison, in the nonprofit paperwork tied to Rourke's latest campaign. A man fresh out of prison, suddenly linked to a city councilman's initiative. Shaq didn't buy redemption stories that were this synchronized. It wasn't long before Renee confirmed what they feared. Families were being bought out, lowball offers from shell companies, disguised as tenant relocation support. Those who didn't accept were suddenly cited for lease violations, plumbing issues, and structural damage. Glenview's infrastructure wasn't just ignored, it was weaponized. And the boys? If Wyatt got custody and relocated them under the pretense of child welfare, their grandmother would lose her lease. The apartment would be abandoned, opening the legal doorway for forced vacancy. It was a playbook, and the boys were the opening move. Shaq's mind raced. He'd grown up in neighborhoods like this. He remembered when his own family was squeezed out of an apartment under renovation, only to watch a gourmet deli rise where his mother's garden used to be. Back then they didn't have the language to call it what it was. Displacement by design. But now he had language. He had tools. And he had something stronger. The community's trust. He started organizing, but not loudly. That came later. First he met with Miss Etta, the twins' grandmother. She sat hunched in a threadbare armchair, oxygen tube in her nose, eyes sharp beneath her frailty. I knew he'd come back, she said when Shaq brought up Wyatt. You think it's real? She shook her head. Wyatt's a man who always shows up when somebody else is paying. He was gone long enough to forget how to lie like family. Shaq sat with her for nearly an hour, listening, asking, building the shape of a story that too many people had ignored. She didn't just know Wyatt. She knew patterns. People who came and went. Inspectors who arrived after complaints but always left with nothing filed. One time, the elevator had failed for 2 weeks, but the repair ticket vanished before anyone could trace it. They want us out, she said simply. But they don't want to look like the bad guys, so they make it hard to stay. Shaq left with more than her words. He left with permission. Miss Etta told him he could fight, not just for her boys but for the whole block. So he started pulling strings. First, he contacted a housing watchdog group out of Brooklyn. They specialized in tracking fraudulent redevelopment practices, especially in low-income areas. Within days, they connected the dots between Rourke's office and 4 different shell companies, all registered to P boxes tied to campaign donors. Then came the education angle. Shaq returned to Westover Elementary and spoke off the record with a custodian named Howard, a man who'd seen 30 years of school politics and could sniff out a funding scam faster than a politician could deny it. Howard confirmed that the school board had quietly approved a pilot partnership with a private charter group. The charter would inherit the building if enrollment dropped below the threshold. So what happens to the current students? Shaq asked. Howard shook his head. They get relocated. Same word they use for buildings. And just like buildings, nobody asks if the foundation's still good. Shaq made a list. Every name, every connection. He wasn't building a case anymore. He was building a timeline. Meanwhile, Wyatt was growing more visible, visiting the shelter with smiles, volunteering at local church kitchens, shaking hands with anyone holding a clipboard. He was performing stability, and some people bought it, but not the ones who mattered. Camden and Jalen had gone quiet again, but this time it was different. They weren't scared. They were angry. One evening, Shaq found a message tucked into a book return bin at the shelter. No names, just a sentence. He's got meetings at night. He doesn't think we're listening. Shaq circled the block where Wyatt now stayed. An apartment provided through the nonprofit, and sure enough, on 3 separate nights Wyatt left after dark, carrying folders, returning empty-handed. Shaq followed once, far enough to stay invisible, close enough to catch an address. The office he entered was a shared space for development contractors. The sign on the door? Kinlock Strategies LLC, a known alias for one of Rourke's holdings. Shaq had everything he needed. The connections, the timeline, the motive, but he knew evidence didn't speak without a platform. He met with Griff and Renee. They didn't rush it. They refined it. They sourced it. By the end of the week, they had a full report ready for publication. Names redacted where necessary, but the story airtight. Griff pitched it to a national outlet. The article was scheduled to drop the following Monday. Shaq, meanwhile, began the real work mobilizing. He didn't hold rallies. He held conversations. In barbershops, on stoops, outside corner stores. He told the story not with outrage, but with precision. He didn't shout. He connected. And the people listened, because the people already knew. They just needed someone to validate what they'd been feeling all along. The tipping point came when Miss Etta was served an eviction notice backdated, signed by a judge who'd been on Rourke's fundraiser invitation list 2 years ago. Shaq went public. He stood on the steps of City Hall, not alone, but surrounded by neighbors, parents, teachers, and former tenants who had been pushed out and silenced. He told them about the missing lunches, the fake scans, the shell companies, the forced custody cases, the stolen addresses dressed up as transition programs. He didn't mention the twins by name. He didn't need to. He ended with one line. We don't want charity. We want clarity. The article dropped that same morning. By nightfall, Rourke's office released a statement denying involvement. The next day, reporters were at Glenview. 2 tenants held up copies of their own quiet eviction slips. Wyatt vanished. No press, no custody hearing. Just gone. The nonprofit's website was taken offline. The charter school deal delayed pending review. Shaq didn't celebrate. He knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time in weeks, he walked past Camden and Jalen as they played on a cracked sidewalk with a basketball too soft to bounce properly, and he saw them laugh. It wasn't just about bread anymore. It was about who gets to stay. And now the city had to answer. Before the world knew him as Big Shaq, the towering figure who made stadiums erupt and sneakers fly off shelves, he was just Shaquille, a boy with too many questions and too few answers. And for the first time, as the shadows around Camden and Jalen deepened, he allowed himself to remember not just the highlight reels or the trophies or the headlines, but the days before the noise, before the name, when survival was the only game he knew how to play. The neighborhood he came from wasn't so different from Glenview. Different zip code maybe, but the same DNA: cracked sidewalks, busted elevators, 1,000 empty promises graffitied onto peeling brick. His mother, Lucille, worked 3 jobs and still managed to walk him to school with a pressed shirt and warm leftovers in a reused Tupperware. She was fierce, proud, and tired, in the way only black mothers can be when the world insists their sons were born guilty. She taught him early how to carry himself, how to walk tall even when everything around him wanted to make him smaller. But some lessons came late. He was 14 the day the cops stopped him outside the bodega. Someone had broken into the register, smashed the front display, taken a few cartons of cigarettes and cash. Shaq didn't even get the chance to explain he'd been across town, helping his neighbor move boxes. The store owner couldn't ID the thief, but he said the kid was big, tall, quiet, moved fast. That was enough. Shaq spent 6 weeks in juvenile detention before the charges were dropped. A clerk had logged the store's security footage a day late, and when it finally surfaced, the timestamp cleared him. There were no apologies, no acknowledgments, just a release form and a warning to be more careful who you hang around. He came home changed. His mother knew it the moment she looked in his eyes. Something had hardened. But then came the thing he didn't expect. An act of kindness. A man named Coach Terrence Bell, local high school legend, turned community rec leader, had followed Shaq's case. No cameras, no protests. Just care. He found Shaq at the court, 3 weeks after his release. Shaq shooting alone, earbuds in, pretending he didn't notice the kids staring. Coach Bell didn't preach. He didn't ask about the case. He just tossed him a fresh pair of sneakers, size 15, and said, "They don't define you, but they sure hope you'll let them try." That single gesture, those words, that presence shifted the axis of Shaq's life. Not instantly, but enough. He started training harder, reading more, showing up. Not to prove he was better, but to make sure they didn't get to write his story. And now, decades later, watching Camden and Jalen get squeezed by a different version of the same machinery, Shaq felt those old ghosts rising. Not to haunt him, but to remind him. He knew what it was like to be criminalized for your size, for your silence, for your skin. He knew how systems smiled at your mother during intake and turned cold the moment the door closed. He knew the language of fake help, the concerned professionals, the "we're just following protocol" types, the ones who knew your name but never your pain. He also knew how easy it was to give up, to believe you were just another case file waiting to disappear. But he didn't, because someone had shown up. So now, it was his turn. Not just to throw breadcrumbs toward hungry kids, or expose bad actors. That was the surface work. He needed to go deeper. Because this wasn't just Wyatt. This wasn't just Rourke. This was a system in a tailored suit, trained to shake hands with one hand while evicting with the other. Shaq returned to the places he'd once avoided. The courthouse where he'd waited, handcuffed for a public defender who barely looked at him. The rec center where Coach Bell had first spoken truth into his bones. It was boarded up now, gutted for future redevelopment. But the memory of that old gym still rang inside him. He stood outside the shell of that place one morning, as the sun cracked over the skyline, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself grieve. For the boy he used to be. For the kids who didn't get second chances. For the ones whose stories ended in silence. Then, he got to work. He met with a network of former juvenile defenders, now running an advocacy group aimed at systemic legal reform. He told them about the twins. Not just the theft, not just Wyatt, but the mechanisms at play, how broken housing, education manipulation, and child welfare incentives were being weaponized to fracture families and erase futures. They'd heard pieces of it before, but not like this, not lived, not named. He brought them to Glenview, introduced them to neighbors, showed them the eviction records, the false inspections, the caseworker deflections. It was more than a story, it was a pattern, and people were listening now. One afternoon, while Shaq was reviewing footage with Renee, she turned to him with something softer than admiration. "You ever think about why it hits you this hard?" she asked. Shaq didn't look up. "Because I remember what it felt like to think nobody would come." She nodded. "You're not just saving them, you're undoing what was done to you." He didn't respond. But the truth of it sat heavy in the room. That night, Camden slipped a page under the shelter office door. It wasn't a note, it was a drawing, 2 tall figures standing beside a smaller one, the word "safe" written above their heads. Shaq kept it, slipped it into the same folder where he kept the old court release form from his own juvenile case. 2 sides of the same story. The next morning he stood outside the courthouse again. This time, not as a defendant, not as a ghost of the past, but as a witness, a builder, a protector. He looked up at the stone archway, hands in his pockets, and whispered under his breath, I'm still here. And so were Camden and Jalen. The system would come again. It always did. But this time, it wouldn't find them alone. The state called it reunification. A clean word. Sterile, non-confrontational. But when the officer handed Miss Etta the temporary custody papers and said Wyatt Kinney would be taking her grandsons, the air in the room turned to ice. There was no hearing, no chance to argue, just signatures on printed sheets, court-ordered language, and two stunned boys with backpacks half-sipped. Camden's face was unreadable. Jalen blinked up at his grandmother, with a kind of quiet that didn't belong on a child's face. Miss Etta didn't cry. She didn't ask the officer for time or explanation. She only said, "You take care of each other," before she closed her eyes and turned her head away. Wyatt didn't speak to Shaq at the transfer. He didn't need to. His smirk said everything. He had what he wanted, or at least what he thought he needed. Camden and Jalen were now his to move, to use, to hold hostage to a system that measured worth in custody papers and subsidy checks. Shaq stood at a distance and watched the car pull away. He didn't chase. He didn't shout. But something old and buried stirred in his chest, a heat he hadn't felt in years. The apartment Wyatt brought the boys to was part of a transitional housing unit on the city's fringe, funded by a non-profit with a mission statement that sounded like salvation, but reeked of sanitized profit. Empowering family futures. Shaq had already started connecting dots. The organization received direct grants from the same municipal trust that supported Councilman Clay Rourke's redevelopment pipeline. A place meant to help reunified families was in fact a funnel, an access point for state funds labeled as child welfare stipend. Renee Callan, who'd helped Shaq through the bureaucratic snarl of licensing regulations and child placement policy, had flagged Wyatt's name 2 weeks before the custody papers were signed. "He's not listed on the housing assignment as a resident," she'd told Shaq, "but he's drawing stipend payments, multiple ones, and I've already found one duplication error the city accountant missed." Griff Temple, meanwhile, traced Wyatt's ties back to a consulting firm quietly bought up by an LLC Rourke had once championed as part of his urban equity campaign. It didn't take long for them to realize what was happening. Wyatt was never fighting to get his sons back. He was fighting to secure a relocation payout. Each move, each custody assignment, each file labeled successful reintegration, came with a bonus check. It was all perfectly legal and deeply corrupt. Shaq didn't have the authority to reverse custody, but what he did have was time, eyes, and a memory like steel. He worked quietly, surgically. He slipped into the housing facility where Wyatt was staying under the pretense of delivering outreach materials from the shelter. With the help of a housing supervisor who'd grown up with Shaq back in Newark's old Southridge district, he planted 3 discrete cameras, one in the hallway, one in the shared kitchen area, and one inside a digital tablet loaded with schoolwork for the boys. The footage didn't show physical harm. It didn't need to. What it captured was worse: neglect with a polished face. Wyatt was gone more often than he was present. He didn't cook. He brought takeout and left it in boxes. He didn't check the boys' schoolwork. The tablet sat untouched for days. The footage showed Camden washing Jalen's socks in the sink, while Wyatt conducted Zoom calls in the other room, never once acknowledging their presence. Then came the key recording. Wyatt on the phone, pacing the hallway. "Yeah, I got him situated. As soon as the caseworker signs off, we're golden. Grant hits by next Friday. I just need him quiet till then." That was the moment Shaq knew this wasn't a broken man trying to rebuild. It was a man playing a system like a slot machine. And the stakes weren't coins, they were children. He didn't go public yet. He wanted the story to unfold the right way, through channels that couldn't be dismissed as spectacle. Renee helped him craft a formal affidavit to challenge Wyatt's custody on the grounds of financial misconduct and neglect. But even with footage, records, and a narrative built brick by brick, the question still hung in the air. Would anyone believe him? Because Wyatt had worked the image game well. He attended community events, donated food to pantries, took smiling photos at Sunday services. His clean-cut transformation played well in courtrooms, where redemption stories often trumped uncomfortable truths. He even filed a cease and desist against Griff Temple for defamation and character harassment. The implication was clear: any attempt to expose him would be framed as a personal vendetta. So Shaq changed tactics. He didn't approach City Hall. He went to the Office of Public Child Advocacy, an entity disconnected from the courts, independent from CPS, and tasked with reviewing policy-based harm. Renee submitted a preliminary report. Griff backed it with public records. Shaq attached the footage brief, strategic clips that showed Wyatt's absence, the boys alone, and the conversation about stipends. The response wasn't immediate. Bureaucracy never moved fast. But the inquiry forced the courts to pause Wyatt's second stipend installment, pending internal investigation. That was enough to rattle him. The cameras picked up his shift in tone. He stopped talking on the phone. He got louder with the boys. Never violent, never scream level, but sharp, frustrated. At one point, Camden could be heard saying, "We're just waiting." And Wyatt muttered back, "Well, I'm tired of waiting." That line mattered, because it revealed intent. Not family. Transaction. Shaq also noticed another change. Camden began leaving small signals. A folded note slipped into a food donation drop-off bin. A drawing tucked into the shelter's mailbox. One afternoon he found a list of names on the back of a comic book. Rourke, Urban Elevate, Empowering Family Futures, with a question scrawled underneath, "Why do they all work together?" The boy wasn't just surviving, he was investigating. And that scared Shaq in a way he hadn't expected. Because no child should ever have to become his own protector. So he escalated. He reached out to Civic Shield, a watchdog group that monitored misappropriation of public housing funds. Their lead investigator, Nora Lang, agreed to conduct an unofficial audit based on the evidence Shaq had provided. 2 weeks later, she contacted him with a file that confirmed everything. Wyatt's consulting firm had been receiving payouts through a grant issued under a redevelopment clause not meant for family housing, but for building clearance initiatives. Meaning Wyatt wasn't being paid to house the boys. He was being paid to remove them from Glenview. With that final link in place, Shaq and Renee filed an emergency motion. Not for reversal, not for punishment, but for removal, to take the boys out of Wyatt's custody under the clause of endangerment by financial exploitation. The hearing was granted. 36 hours notice. Shaq didn't go in alone. He brought Miss Etta, escorted in a wheelchair. He brought 2 neighbors who had seen Wyatt leave the boys unattended for full weekends. And he brought the final clip, the only one he hadn't shared with anyone outside his circle. It showed Camden tucking Jalen into bed, while Wyatt's voice drifted in from the next room, bragging over speakerphone. "I don't care what they say. The kids ain't my future. They're my invoice." Silence followed that clip in the courtroom. Even the judge had to look down. When the gavel came down, Wyatt's custody was terminated. Not revoked permanently, but enough to take the boys out of his care until a full investigation concluded. Shaq didn't celebrate. He stepped outside the courthouse and waited. Camden came out first. Eyes still guarded, still old. But this time he looked at Shaq and said one word. "Thanks." Then Jalen, holding the same journal Shaq had once given him, now filled with pages. He handed it over. "You should read it," he said. "It's got everything." Shaq nodded, but didn't open it yet. That would come later. For now he watched as the boys stepped into a car not owned by the system, not headed toward another trap. For the first time in too long, they were going somewhere without strings. And Shaq. He wasn't done. Because if this was a test of fire, he had passed. From that day on, Shaq hit every local corner that would have him: barbershops, school gyms, housing co-ops. He stood at fish fries, food pantry lines, open mics. He told the story not in headlines, but in heartbeats. He told it in a way that made people see themselves in the twins, that made silence feel like complicity. He didn't start with the corruption. He started with Camden sharing his lunch with Jalen. Miss Etta tucking oxygen tubing behind her ears before blessing her grandsons' heads. Jalen's journal pages, folded and worn, handed off like evidence of hope. He gave people more than outrage. He gave them faces. And faces fight harder than facts. The momentum exploded when a local teacher came forward anonymously, admitting she had been pressured to report false attendance for state funding purposes. That triggered a school board investigation, forcing an emergency audit of Westover Elementary and other public schools listed in the same federal education grant. Suddenly, news vans appeared outside Glenview. The story caught national attention, not because it was new, but because someone finally gave it a name. The term welfare laundering began trending, used to describe how people like Wyatt and the developers funding him siphoned aid money meant for families and turned it into silent displacement. That's when the blowback started. Councilman Rourke, until now quiet behind office doors, made a press appearance. He stood before a polished podium, denying involvement, brushing off the video as taken out of context, and painting Shaq as a well-intentioned but misinformed celebrity using selective outrage to stir unrest. The media split. Half covered the soundbites. The other half started digging. Griff, now with the credibility of community truth-teller, published a full exposé linking Rourke's campaign fund to 5 of the LLCs Shaq had flagged, each one connected to failed or incomplete housing redevelopments in poor neighborhoods, each one with money trails leading to private accounts. Shaq didn't clap back on TV. Instead, he hosted a town hall in the Glenview courtyard. Folding chairs, a wireless mic, nothing scripted. He didn't lead with accusation. He led with Camden's voice, a recording of the boy reading from his journal. People think silence means we're okay, but we just don't have the words yet. So here's some. After that, people stood up one by one. Former tenants, school nurses, caseworkers who'd left the system because they were tired of writing reports that no one read. They named names. Not with venom, but with clarity. They told stories of evictions disguised as maintenance work, of reports denied for lack of evidence, even when photos were submitted, of families relocated overnight to motels, with no return plan. And the cameras kept rolling. By week's end, state legislators called for an independent investigation into housing redevelopment fraud, citing Newark as a model case study. Rourke's office was served with subpoenas. Wyatt vanished from public view entirely. His nonprofit's website was taken down. The phone lines disconnected. But even then, Shaq wasn't done. He went to Westover Elementary, stood outside during dismissal, and passed out copies of a flyer titled, "Know Your Rights When They Knock on Your Door." It wasn't flashy. It didn't carry his name. But it was the most powerful thing he'd ever handed out. Parents read it. Some cried. Others held it like a shield. Because now, they knew they weren't alone. That someone was watching. That someone was willing to speak when the streets couldn't. Renee called that night, her voice caught between exhaustion and awe. "You changed the weather, Shaq." He paused before answering. "No, I just opened the window." Later, as he walked through the neighborhood, people waved. A boy ran up, handed him a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil. "It's good," the boy said. "Better than bread alone." Shaq smiled, something deep and rare surfacing in his chest. Not because the fight was over, but because the silence was. The city didn't erupt. No fireworks, no parades. When the news of Wyatt's arrest broke, it came not with spectacle, but with a quiet, satisfying finality, like a long-held breath finally released. It started as a headline tucked in the lower third of the evening news. Local man charged in multi-county fraud scheme, targeting at-risk youth. And just beneath that, in smaller print, Councilman Clay Rourke resigns amid ethics investigation. But for the people on the ground, for Glenview, for the shelter, for Camden and Jalen, it was more than news. It was a crack in the machine, the beginning of something long overdue. Wyatt's charges were specific and surgical. Fraud, coercion, financial misrepresentation. He wasn't brought down by outrage or online heat. He was brought down by paper cold, undeniable receipts, bank records linked to shell payouts, falsified progress reports submitted to the state, and recordings that painted him not as a flawed father, but a calculated middleman in a quiet industry of displacement. When they came for him, it was during a scheduled review hearing. No sirens, just 2 officers in plain clothes, and a clerk with a sealed envelope. Shaq didn't attend the hearing. He didn't need to. He was 3 blocks away, helping Miss Etta unpack a new oxygen machine, donated anonymously after the boy's story aired on public radio. She didn't say much, but when she looked at Shaq, her smile cracked just enough to show something rare: peace. Jalen was sitting on the couch, legs swinging over the edge, reading from his journal. Camden was by the window, sketching again, this time not in grayscale shadows, but with color. Real color. Blues, oranges, streaks of warmth. Shaq watched them for a moment before stepping outside, not because he didn't want to be there, but because he needed to breathe. He needed to process that after all the late nights, all the whispers, all the dead ends. They were finally home. But the victory didn't stop at the door of Unit 3. Glenview itself was changing. The same week Rourke resigned, a coalition of community organizers and local housing advocates pushed through an emergency zoning reform, the Neighborhood Stability Protection Act, a grant-backed initiative that legally shielded identified high-risk housing blocks from private buyouts, unless full community approval was secured. Glenview was among the first properties registered. This time the language was airtight. No loopholes, no backdoor deals, no silent displacement. Tenants could no longer be forced out under safety revisions that conveniently aligned with commercial development timelines. Shaq didn't take credit. He didn't stand at podiums or issue statements. But everyone knew who'd cracked the door open. The Maple Grove shelter, which had struggled for months to keep its lights on, suddenly received a surge in anonymous donations, private checks, food supplies, school supplies, even heating units. No one claimed responsibility. But tucked into one of the packages was a single envelope. Inside, a note written in Camden's unmistakable handwriting. "You gave us more than food. You gave us our names back." Shaq folded the note and placed it inside the shelter's main ledger, where it would remain taped to the last page, underlined in red. Still, he wasn't interested in building a monument. He wanted a foundation. Something that didn't depend on city funding or PR. Something that wouldn't get cut the next time the budget ran dry. And so, quietly, without press or partnership announcements, Shaq bought the vacant lot behind the shelter, once an empty gravel patch, now a blank canvas. With the help of volunteers, some local tradespeople, some high schoolers from Westover, and a few of the kids who once sat in shelter lines, he built a space not out of glass or steel, but out of wood, sweat, and time. By the end of 3 months, the space had a name: the Uplift Room. It wasn't big, but it was alive. Inside there were shelves of books, notebooks, computers donated from a local tech collective. There was a basketball hoop in the back lot, and 2 couches in the corner that always seemed to be full of laughter or sleepy heads. And at the heart of it was a small plaque for Camden and Jalen, and for every child who learned to dream again. The program ran without a dollar from the city. It didn't need it. Local barbers donated time teaching budgeting. A retired math teacher gave weekly tutoring sessions. Artists came through to teach workshops. And Shaq, he showed up every day. Sometimes he ran drills. Sometimes he just listened. And sometimes when the mood was right, he told stories. Not about basketball, but about resilience. About what it meant to be underestimated. About the power of being seen. And how sometimes the greatest victories weren't won in courts or arenas, but in rooms like this. Rooms where kids could finally breathe, without apology. Camden and Jalen became regulars. They didn't stand at the front. They didn't lead sessions. But they watched. They helped. Jalen began cataloging the books, creating a handwritten checkout system. Camden turned his sketches into murals, one of which spanned the north wall, 2 hands holding a loaf of bread, broken in half, sunlight spilling out from the crust. It became the room's unofficial symbol. Because, as Shaq often reminded people, this whole thing had started with bread, a simple act of desperation. 2 hungry boys, 1 stolen loaf, and a city that finally woke up. One afternoon, Griff stopped by with a copy of the final article he published, now archived in a digital journal on urban policy reform. He handed it to Shaq without ceremony. "You made noise without breaking anything," he said. "That's rare." Shaq skimmed it, then closed the file. "I didn't want noise," he said. "I wanted a door. One that doesn't shut behind them." Griff nodded. "Well, you built one." A week later, Renee visited the shelter. She walked the grounds of the Uplift Room, nodding at every detail. Her eyes landed on the mural. "You gonna expand?" she asked. "Not unless it needs to be," Shaq replied. "Small's honest." She smiled. "Still, maybe one day we make it big enough so no kid ever has to knock. They just walk in." He liked that. He liked the idea that maybe, just maybe, they were building something undeniable. And though the city still spun with problems, and though corruption doesn't die, it only hides, Shaq had proven one thing: you don't need a badge or a seat at the table to protect your own. You just need to stand, and stay standing. That night, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the blacktop, Shaq sat outside on a folding chair listening to the sound of a game in progress. Not on TV, right there in front of him. A pickup match between 7 kids, none older than 12, shouting rules and calling fouls with the kind of wild freedom only trust brings. Camden was on the sidelines, sketching. Jalen stood at half court, arms out, calling for the pass. And Big Shaq? He just watched. He didn't need to speak. The streets were finally speaking for themselves. You said a fire only spreads if no one throws water. It had been bent, pocket-worn, and refolded so many times that the creases were starting to split. But Shaq carried it every day, not as a reminder of what he'd done, but of what had been possible. Because for all the headlines, the policy changes, the praise he'd politely sidestepped, Shaq knew the real truth. He didn't save those boys. They saved him. They reminded him why he came back to Newark, why he stayed when others told him to move on, why he traded arenas for backlots, endorsements for backpacks, and glory for grit. He'd been drifting before them. Still working, still helping, but not feeling it the same way. Not letting it reach that place he'd sealed off long ago. After the league, after the cameras, after the noise faded. But the boys, their hunger, their resilience, their refusal to vanish even when the world told them they should, had cracked something open. He took a sip of coffee, eyes still on them. It wasn't about the bread anymore. It never really was. Bread had just been the signal. The first sign of a deeper need. Because hunger wasn't always about empty stomachs. Sometimes, it was about justice, about being heard in rooms built to forget you. Sometimes it was about love, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. And sometimes, it was about the simple, stubborn, holy need to stay in your home. That was the real victory. Not the arrest, not the funding, not the policy shifts. It was that the boys got to stay. In their neighborhood. With their people. On their terms. Inside the shelter, breakfast was already underway. A new group of volunteers, kids from the uplift room, were plating eggs and toast, laughing over whose dishwashing playlist had more skips. Miss Etta had taken over the garden box behind the building, growing mint and tomatoes and peppers like she was feeding an army. Griff was inside, rewriting one of his old op-eds into a middle school curriculum on community activism. Renee had joined the board of a new task force investigating misuse of redevelopment grants in 4 cities. None of them did it for credit. They did it because once you've seen how deep the cracks go, you don't walk away. You patch what you can, then you teach others to do the same. Shaq rubbed his knees. They ached more these days. But he didn't mind it. Ache meant he was still in the game. And this game, this work, it didn't end at the buzzer. It kept going. Street to street. Name to name. The sprinkler let out a soft hiss and sputtered to a stop. Jalen flopped on the grass. Arms wide, chest heaving from joy. Camden sat beside him, shaking water from his hair. They looked over and waved. Shaq raised his cup in return. Behind him, the sound of construction picked up again. Volunteers hammering beams into the next phase of the uplift expansion. A new classroom, a storage unit, maybe even a recording booth, if they got enough donations. Kids wanted to tell their stories. Shaq would make sure they had a place to do it. No sponsorships. No bureaucracy. Just people. Building for people. He reached down and picked up the old journal Camden had once filled. He hadn't opened it in weeks, but now, with the sun warming his back and the sound of life all around him, he flipped through its pages slowly. There were new entries in the back drawings. Thoughts. A list titled, "What We Still Need."
The last item on the list?
More chairs. For when everyone shows up. Shaq chuckled under his breath. Because they would. More kids. More names. More stories just like this one. And when they came, when they knocked, when they asked if there was space at the table, there would be. Because that's what it meant to hold the line. To say enough. To make space. Not just for survival, but for thriving. He stood slowly, joints cracking like old floorboards, and made his way back into the shelter. As he passed through the kitchen, someone handed him a sandwich wrapped in foil, peanut butter, and banana. His favorite. He took it with a nod. Then he walked back out and sat beside the boys, unwrapping it while they leaned against him. Still dripping, still breathless. "You know," he said, voice low, "when I was your age, I used to think hunger was just about food. But it's not. It's about being seen. It's about having a place, a right to be here." Jalen looked up. "You mean like home?" "Exactly like that," Shaq said. Camden leaned back against the steps. "So what now?" Shaq looked out across the yard, where new kids were arriving, where fresh bricks were stacked, where laughter was starting to become a regular sound again. "Now," he said, "now we set the table." He broke the sandwich in half and handed it to them. And the 3 of them sat there, under a warming sky, where nothing had come easy, but everything, finally, was beginning to feel earned. Because when a community stands up, no one leaves the table hungry. Fade out. What would you do if justice came wrapped in silence? This story isn't just about 2 boys. It's about systems that erase, and people who choose to see. If this moved something in you, don't scroll past it. Let this be the moment you stay awake. Stories like this keep breathing, because people like you keep listening.